The title is the Inconvenient Feminine, Removing Ambiguity and Picking Fights. And we're going to see how many fights I can pick today. So the last year at the Student Symposium, I noted how despite the medieval's attempt to see the divine force of nature in woman and have that shine out through her in all of its glory, the move the last 2 centuries or so has been to divorce that from her and sort of just chuck that back out into nature as a simultaneously destructive and life-giving force to anybody who encounters her. And I asked the question at the end, what is left of woman when we do so, if she is no longer recognized as the most distilled point of half of existence? If the feminine, capital F, and women are not intrinsically linked in some way, shade into each other, are these just costumes to shuck off or throw on at the earliest convenience? Now I've actually snuck in a rather large claim there that I didn't make last year, that the feminine, or rather woman, is the most distilled embodiment of half of existence. And that's because half of existence is feminine. The feminine is embedded in at least half of existence, sharing it with the masculine. And that's not just because we recognize ourselves as male, female, man, woman, masculine, feminine, and then project it. Now, existence manifests itself as such. Life arises from the interaction between these two halves, and that's physics, but we don't have time for that. So it's this interaction between, let's say, the active and the passive, like what is known and what is unknown, what is and what could be, and the feminine is the later in each of these, the passive half of these. And well, let me back up some of this outrageous stuff. Let's see here. Throughout time, we've always characterized nature and all things therein as feminine. And in the most concrete and obvious sense, any food that you eat comes from nature. So nature is that which sustains from its own body. But you could also be the food in nature, so it can also be quite dangerous. Nature is also that which births from itself. All new, novel things spring forth from nature. This all comes out of the cosmos, out of its own body, and those things can be quite dangerous. As we move out, we explore, we discover new lands, new people, new food, but eventually we do enough exploration, we figure out these laws that allow us to create the atomic bomb. And so nature bears out the results of the actions taken within it, and so nature is also the space of action, and that space can be quite treacherous. But it is this open, beckoning opportunity. And in that, nature, we'll cap it at 4, is that which calls to act in the space provided. And so that call can be quite deceptive, because if you look at nature, all the things that are so beautiful, it's basically saying, like, you look at me, come to me, I have something for you. And it's not always a nice thing that you end up with. But woman is obviously the most pinpoint of at least these 4 primary parts of nature. And what, I have a slide. What provides and sustains from its own body, what bears from its own body, what is the space of action, and what calls to act. And those are the feminine. Those are woman. Woman is this. And all I can say, like, I'm just biased, it's very Western, or that's just very ancient, nobody thinks like that anymore. And fine, we can go so far east that we end up isolated with the American Indians, okay? The Penobscot Indians of the American Northeast understood that the first woman, not goddess, the first woman was sacrificed by the first man so he could drag her body through a field by the hair, and that way crops grew, and then their children would eat and not starve. So her body became the sustenance for all future generations, for the future. And you can see here that the previous generations also then sustain the future, and women are, for them, a closer link to the past and to the dead. Also, women were typically associated with specific crops. It was their responsibility to tend to, especially corn, prepare the field, plant the seeds, all that jazz. Meanwhile, the men were responsible for performing the sacred rites and rituals that would ensure that these things grew and bore fruit. And so you can understand it's the space of action provided is the action taken to bring on the transformation, and then the results borne out. Please don't make me get more explicit than that. So let's see here. Women in the Great Plains traditions especially were literally the homemakers. They knew best how to build the home and also the medicine lodge. And this was knowledge passed down to them by the white buffalo goddess, which is important because their homes were made out of buffalo hide. So the goddess was the home. The women are the home. They are not just responsible for, but are these places of renewal and life. And I think what I found most interesting among all these accounts was how they were discussing ownership. In the Great Plains, ownership typically passed matrilineally. And so land, title, all of that passed through women. They would appoint a lord to oversee the lands, but they could also choose to remove him. And when they started moving on to the reservations, the way they talked about this started to change. And you can understand why if you think about it. Men, being the active masculine half of existence, will act on whatever they have, will in that sense consume it so that the transformation occurs and the future happens. Consuming is not necessarily negative. It must happen so you can move forward. But the feminine, being the passive, the woman half, right, holds. Women are the space for all things, are the home, are where all things come to live and come to rest. And you can see that in this sense of the life and death, the beginning and the end. Women are at the beginning and end of all things. And you can understand that just with childbirth, right? So in the moments of childbirth, women are obviously the gateway to the future that is born. It is born through them. But it is almost so simultaneously when they are the closest to death than anyone ever so willingly is in their lifetimes. And the tribes of North America practice the rites and rituals associated with all these parts of life into the 20th century, if I have my dates correctly, and that is not ancient. So civilizations the world over, all throughout time, have held these truths to be self-evident, right? And so that's why you have Persephone being the goddess of spring and the queen of the underworld. Why Isis is associated with life and death, Kali is associated with life and death. There's a Hine goddess in New Zealand that is multiple in her manifestations. And so back to the question, when we tear this out of woman, what is left? And I've come to, after much deliberation, this, absent that half of existence, the feminine, a woman is a strange-looking man with a hole instead of a pole. And I'm sorry to be crass, but I am not wrong, okay? We can say silly things like, oh, not all women do this or that or are like this or that, but exceptions don't make the rule. And ladies, we can say silly things like, oh, I'm not like other girls. And we can do that until the cows come home, but so can any tranny. And if we want to quibble about categories being exclusive, we are missing the point. Why have we done this to ourselves, right? Why has the culture at large done its darndest to tear the feminine out of women and tear half of existence out of humanity and then just chuck it away into the wild again as something to simultaneously rile against and cower from? I don't do much different to any women who would like to actually say, no, this is what I would like to actually do. I would like to embody especially the best parts of these things. So there was Christendom, right? Christendom had done a good job at separating out these calls of the dualistic feminine to the, let's say, vice and sin of Eve compared to the virtue and sacrifice of Mary. And it's only really when you take this out of woman, the agency that gives it, that you get a woman who can be as multiple and legion in her manifestations and her characteristics. Only when you divorce the agency that gave women do you get, like, it becomes a question of not if, but when a woman will suddenly destroy the men attracted to her or even the children she provides for. And I don't know why exactly we lost that throughout time, because we already had in the Divine Comedy a beautiful representation of this, because it's saturated with the feminine if you read it. And Dante is not necessarily making a claim, or rather a focus on just perfection, but also the choice that we make to pursue vice or virtue. And so you get then these two areas of the feminine, the virtuous and the vicious, and a woman will become the perfect vessel for whichever one she wills towards. And both of these sides are still rooted in, let's say, the allure, the sustenance, oh, look at that, the allure, the sustenance, and the, let's say, demand and judgment of nature. And if you want to bring this into archetypal terms, you can say, well, on the level of allure, a woman is either a maiden or a whore. On the level of sustenance, a woman is either mother or a witch. On the level of demand or judgment, a woman is a matriarch or madam, like in a brothel, right? And so it's not a matter of perfection, but direction. If it was just perfection, it wouldn't matter which way you went. You could be the perfect whore if you put in the effort, but we don't have to get into that. So it seems, well, I don't really like this kind of discourse, but you can't really get around the fact that throughout history, the majority of the voices we have are those of men. And so passions and the feminine are very closely linked. And you should only need one guess as to why. And we can hear Augustine even in this case, right? Waxing lustful about even music. And how could he not? Music is governed by the muses, Calliope chief among them. Or what about his desire for wisdom and knowledge, Sophia? Or what about any man's desire for success and victory, Nike? Do you notice anything about these ladies? So it seems to me that, again, despite the medieval's desire to separate this out, you still have that same sense that Augustine has. Obviously, the passions will potentially lead you astray. They can do that, and he makes that conclusion, Augustine makes that conclusion, just like Socrates or Plato before him, or maybe even Dante and Petrarch after him. And then Nietzsche gets in on it with the resentment of the feminine in particular. Even the feminists of the 19th century do that. And now the culture at large more or less does. And they won't really admit that. That's essentially what's happening. And so, excuse me, I do have some notes. Despite all that, love, agape in particular, as a virtue in Christendom cannot be such an actively deceptive force. That's more the realm of, say, erao or epithemeo. And Augustine does recognize that it is our own shortcomings that will fall to, let's say, lust instead of love. Oh, but maybe the music is just a little too melodic, right? Perhaps it's just one temptation too far. How could I ever resist? It wasn't my fault. It was the woman whom you gave me, right? And so it's the love of something, eros, the say ancient boogeyman that overcomes your powers of reason, that seems the culture has latched onto, instead of recognizing agape, a call that you choose to either accept or reject. And because despite agape being a call, it's inherently passive because a call must be answered. And that's what Nietzsche is actually has a pretty sassy quote about this. Who hateth woman most? Thus spoke the iron to the magnet. I hate thee most because thou attractest, but art too weak to draw unto thee. And you can see, how dare you be so beautiful? Like, how dare you attract me like this? Now I have to do something about it. And it's important to make that distinction, because in the ancients critiqued Christianity for being too feminine, right? Because agape was the main focus of the New Testament. And so throughout time, you see that there are women torn down, even in myth and legend, for being perceived as an active threat when they were not. And that, anyways, so the virtuous feminine, right? As a virtuous light in the dark, the woman who embodies that will probably be seen as something vicious, because absent the turn inward, all these things will be seen as its opposite. We will act according to how we experience things instead of how things actually are. And I think that, no, I'm getting distracted. I don't have to do that. Sorry. Let's see here. What's next? Oh, that's right. And it sounds like this is very much a man versus woman thing, and it's not. Literally anybody can act like this. And we can see that just in the culture at large. I imagine any, let's say, a woman of ill repute would not like consistent reminders of who she should be. And you can see that if we do make it, let's say, more simplistic in the sense of like, let's say, sexual tension, a man confronting something virtuous, if he is not living up to what he should be, will perceive that as a potential downfall, because it is in that, like, the ancient perception over the self-recognition leads to viewing the opposite, experiencing it as something that is inherently negative. And because of that, if a man or a woman is perceiving something virtuous like that, well, why not just get rid of the feminine altogether? We don't want to just view women like that, because it's easier that way, isn't it? It's easier to remove that which would force us to confront the most difficult parts of ourselves. And becoming who we could be at our greatest is difficult, is an admission of present inadequacy. And so one lacking humility will view a judge and see it as a predator, will see that, will be like being judged and found wanting is only a downfall. The potential to climb to somewhere higher can only be seen as a descent into the underworld. And so it seems that we tend to meet our destiny on the roads we take to avoid it. And we wreak our own destruction, suffer the consequences of our actions or inactions, because we tend to err on the side of preserving our own comfort. And in that is potentially a satisfying vice that will contort this call into, at best make it unintelligible, or at worst make it an enemy. And we've seen this. That's the story of Cassandra, of Dorothea from Middlemarch, of Joan of Arc, of Antigone. And we see that in these moments, there was an opportunity to perhaps rise to somewhere higher. And I'm almost done, I promise. If I'm over time, forgive me. So it's much easier to just stagnate, isn't it? It's much easier to even just degenerate or destroy, and just tell ourselves, just honey, hush, like, don't worry about it. It's much easier here, isn't it? We're already here, we're already fine. And I think that such talk only prevails when the culture at large has failed to turn inward and take stock of whatever potential vice we may be clinging to, pride, envy, it doesn't matter, and start to work to somewhere higher. But also, I think that happens when, like, say, the voice of the feminine has gone silent. And, well, I don't know how positive I've come off today, but I know I'm not that quiet. So I'm gonna keep talking about all of this. It's my plan to go through these stories, but we're gonna do more on that tomorrow. So thank you very much.